The weight of the silver tray was a familiar anchor in the shifting sea of the afternoon service. Maya moved between tables with an economy of motion learned over years of balancing plates and placating egos. The clink of ice in a glass, the low murmur of conversation, the scent of seared scallops and lemon, it was the rhythm of her life. She placed a heavy crystal water glass on the white linen of table 12, her movements smooth and silent. The man watched her. She felt his gaze like a change in air pressure. He sat with two other men, all of them in suits so dark they seemed to drink the light from the room. But he was the center of gravity. His stillness was absolute, a predator conserving energy. She had served powerful men before. Wall Street sharks with predatory smiles and politicians who spoke of the public good while their eyes stripped you bare. This was different. This was older, colder. This was power that did not need to be announced. She offered the menus, her voice a polished, neutral tone. "Good afternoon. May I get you started with something to drink?" The man's eyes, the color of burnt espresso, finally met hers. He did not look at the menu. He leaned forward slightly, the fabric of his jacket pulling taut across his shoulders. His voice was a low rumble, a sound that seemed to come from the stone foundations of the city itself. He spoke, and the language that filled the space between them was not English. It was a cascade of clipped vowels and hard, rolling consonants, a dialect from the old country's forgotten mountain villages. It was a language of stone and vendetta, a secret code meant to exclude, to test, to remind her of her place. He was ordering, she realized, but he was also delivering a verdict. "You are nothing. You do not belong here." His men smirked, their eyes glinting with casual cruelty. The humiliation was the point. The manager, hovering nervously by the service station, began to pale. This was not a customer you could afford to offend. However, the language was not a mystery to her. It was the sound of her childhood, the lullabies her grandmother had hummed under her breath, the frustrated curses she had muttered while kneading dough. It was the language of home, a home Maya had spent her entire adult life trying to forget. She held his gaze, letting the silence stretch until it became a weapon of its own. Then, her own voice dropping into the same forgotten cadence, the rhythm as familiar and unwelcome as her own heartbeat, she replied. "The wild boar ragout is excellent today," she said in the tongue of his ancestors. "It would pair well with a bold red from the private cellar. Perhaps the 1982 vintage." The smirks on his men's faces vanished, replaced by slack-jawed shock. The manager froze mid-step. But the man, Dante, did not look surprised. He looked intrigued. A flicker of something ancient and calculating moved in the depths of his dark eyes. He had set a trap, and she had not only avoided it, she had revealed herself to be something far more dangerous than a simple waitress. She had revealed she knew his secrets. And in his world, secrets were a liability that had to be controlled, or eliminated. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. "Bring it," he commanded in English, his voice now flat and devoid of any warmth. As Maya turned to leave, the professional calm she wore like a uniform began to crack. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Answering him had been a reflex, a stupid spark of pride she could not swallow. She had wanted to wipe the condescension from his face, to show him she was more than a red vest and a polite smile. But in doing so, she had painted a target on her own back. She had stepped out of the anonymous crowd and into the stark, unforgiving light of his attention. When she returned with the wine, a bottle that cost more than her month's rent, he was waiting. His men were still there, but their posture had changed. They were no longer relaxed. They were guards. She performed the ritual of presenting and opening the wine with hands that she willed to be steady. She poured a small amount for him to taste. He swirled the deep red liquid in his glass, his eyes never leaving her face. He was not tasting wine. He was tasting her nerve. "Leave the bottle," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of an order that would not be disobeyed. She placed the bottle on the table and turned to go, desperate to retreat to the relative safety of the bustling kitchen. "You," he said, the single word stopping her cold. "Stay." It was not a request. He gestured to the empty chair at his table. One of his men stood and pulled it out for her. It was an invitation that felt like a summons, a courtesy that felt like a cage. "I have other tables, sir," she said, her voice tight. "They can wait," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "Sit down, Maya." Hearing her name on his lips sent a chill down her spine. He had read her name tag. Of course he had. He was a man who noticed everything. She looked toward her manager, a silent plea for help, but he quickly averted his eyes, suddenly fascinated by a spot on the far wall. No one would help her. She was on her own. Slowly, she walked to the chair and sat, her back ramrod straight. The linen of her apron felt flimsy, ridiculous armor against the tailored wool of their suits. The silence at the table was thick and heavy. His men did not speak. They simply watched her, their expressions unreadable. Dante took a slow sip of his wine, his eyes still locked on hers. "That dialect is not common," he said, his English precise. "It is from a very specific place. A small village in the mountains. A place where families have long memories. My grandmother was from the old country," she said, offering a sliver of the truth, hoping it would be enough. "Your grandmother," he repeated, the words tasting strange in his mouth. "What was her name?" This was the real question. This was the test. She could lie, invent a name, and maybe he would be satisfied. But looking into his eyes, she knew a lie would be a fatal mistake. He would know. A man like him dealt in truth and consequence. "Ariana," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Something shifted in his expression. It was not surprise, but a deep, resonant confirmation, like a final puzzle piece clicking into place. The air grew colder. He knew the name. He had been waiting for it. "Tell your manager you are leaving for the day," he said. It was a dismissal. "My driver will take you home." She stood, her legs unsteady. It felt like a reprieve, but she knew it was not. It was a leash. He was letting her walk away, but he now knew her name, her history, her face. He would not forget. As she walked away from the table, she felt his eyes on her back, branding her. She was no longer Maya, the waitress. She was Ariana's granddaughter. And for some reason she could not begin to fathom, that meant she belonged to him now. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of forced smiles and mechanical movements. Every time the bell at the door chimed, she expected to see one of his men walk in. Every shadow in a corner seemed to hold a watchful pair of eyes. She was a marked woman. When her shift finally ended, she changed out of her uniform, the red vest feeling like a target. Outside, the city air was thick with the promise of a summer storm. A sleek black car, the kind that glides through traffic like a shark, was parked at the curb. The driver, a man built like a brick wall, got out and opened the back door for her. "Mr. Costello sent me," he said, his voice a gravelly monotone. Dante Costello. The name resonated with a quiet, deadly authority she had only ever read about in hushed newspaper articles about the city's underworld. "That's not necessary," she said, her hand clutching the strap of her bag. "I can take the subway." It was not a suggestion, the driver said, his expression unchanging. There was no choice. Arguing would be pointless and possibly dangerous. She got into the car, the leather seats cool against her skin. The door closed with a heavy, final thud, sealing her in. As the car pulled away from the curb, she looked back at the restaurant, her ordinary world receding in the rearview mirror. She had a terrible feeling she would never be able to go back. The car did not take her to her small apartment in Queens. It moved smoothly through the city, heading downtown, toward the gleaming towers of wealth and power that scraped the sky. She said nothing, her mind racing. What did he want? Why was her grandmother's name so important to him? The car descended into a private underground garage, the silence broken only by the hum of the engine. The driver led her to a private elevator, which opened directly into a penthouse apartment. The space was vast and minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking, godlike view of the entire city. The furniture was sparse and elegant, the colors muted grays and blacks. It was not a home. It was a fortress, a command center. Dante was standing by the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking out at the city as if he owned it. He probably did. He turned as she entered, his face impassive. "Thank you for joining me," he said, his tone laced with an irony that made her skin crawl. "I didn't have a choice," she shot back, her fear giving way to a spark of anger. A corner of his mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. "Choice is a luxury. Loyalty is a necessity. I need to know where yours lies." He gestured to a leather armchair. "You know the old tongue. You know the name Ariana. Tell me what else you know." "I know my grandmother left her village to escape men like you," she said, her voice shaking slightly, but her gaze steady. "Men who thought they owned everything and everyone." He took a step closer, his presence filling the room, making it feel small and suffocating. He smelled of whiskey and something else, something clean and sharp like cedar. "The men she was escaping were my enemies. Not my family." He stopped in front of her, so close she could see the faint lines around his eyes, the hint of a scar just at his hairline. "Your grandmother was promised to my brother." The words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Maya stared at him, her mind struggling to process the information. "Promised? Like property?" "That's insane," she breathed. "People don't do that anymore." "My family does," he said simply, as if explaining an immutable law of nature. "It was an alliance, a bond of blood to end a feud. But she ran. She broke the oath. My brother, he never recovered." He turned away from her and walked to a heavy wooden desk. From a drawer, he pulled out a small, worn photograph. He held it out to her. Hesitantly, she took it. It was a black and white picture of a young man and a young woman, standing in front of a rustic stone house. The man was handsome, with a wide, easy smile and Dante's same dark eyes. The woman beside him was undeniably her grandmother, young and beautiful, but her expression was haunted, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "That is Marco," Dante said, his voice softer now, tinged with a grief that was still raw after all these years. "My older brother. He was killed a year after she left. The feud reignited. Her family blamed ours. Ours blamed hers. She disappeared to America, and the wound never closed." Maya sank into the chair, the photograph trembling in her hand. The stories her grandmother had told her were fragmented, full of shadows and unspoken fears. She had spoken of a feud, of a promise she couldn't keep, of a love she had to leave behind. But she had never explained the whole truth. She had run, not just for herself, but from a destiny that would have bound her to a world of violence. "What does this have to do with me?" Maya asked, her voice small. "You are her blood," Dante said, his gaze intense. "You carry her legacy, and you speak the tongue. In my world, such things are not coincidences. They are signs. They are debts." Before she could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the room. The window beside Dante exploded inward, showering the floor with 1,000 glittering shards of glass. Instinct took over. Dante moved with a speed that was terrifying, tackling her out of the chair and onto the thick rug, his body a heavy, solid shield over hers. "Stay down," he hissed, his voice a low growl in her ear. The warmth of his breath was on her neck, the solid weight of him pressing her into the floor. For a terrifying second, all she could feel was the thunder of his heart against her back. The world outside the penthouse, with its rules and civility, had just been shattered along with the window. She was in his world now, a world of snipers and blood feuds, and he was the only thing between her and a bullet. The moment stretched, silent and fraught with tension. Dante listened, his body coiled and ready. After a long minute, he slowly pushed himself up, pulling her with him. He kept one hand on her arm, his grip like steel. "A message," he said, his eyes scanning the shattered window and the street far below. "From the Falcone family. They are getting bold." He looked down at his arm. A long, shallow gash from a piece of flying glass was bleeding freely, staining the pristine white cuff of his shirt a brilliant crimson. "You're hurt," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. He glanced at the wound as if it were a minor inconvenience. "It is nothing." "It needs to be cleaned," she insisted, her professional instincts kicking in over the fear. "Where do you keep a first aid kit?" He gave her a long, appraising look. There was no panic in her eyes, only a focused determination. He gave a curt nod toward a door. "In the bathroom behind that panel." She found the kit, her hands moving with purpose. When she returned, he was sitting on the edge of the sofa, his jacket off, his sleeve rolled up. She knelt before him, dabbing at the wound with an antiseptic wipe. He did not flinch. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. The work was grounding. The simple, methodical task of cleaning and dressing the wound gave her something to focus on besides the shattered window and the fact that someone had just tried to kill him. She worked in silence, aware of his stillness, of the heat radiating from his skin. Her fingers brushed against his, and a jolt, sharp and unexpected, shot up her arm. She began to stitch the cut with a butterfly bandage, her touch gentle but firm. This was a line being crossed. She was no longer just a witness. She was tending to his wounds, becoming part of his survival. She was becoming an accessory. "You are not afraid," he stated, his voice a low murmur. She didn't look up from her work. "I'm too busy to be afraid," she replied, concentrating on pulling the edges of the skin together. His hand covered hers, his fingers warm and strong, stilling her movements. She finally lifted her gaze to his. The coldness in his eyes had been replaced by something else, something deeper and more complex. "My brother would have liked you," he said, and the admission felt more intimate than a kiss. He admired strength. The words were a confession of a kind, a confession of connection, of a trust he was reluctantly beginning to feel. The air between them crackled with an energy that had nothing to do with the violence that had just occurred and everything to do with the two of them, kneeling on the floor of a fortress in the sky. Just then his phone buzzed. He released her hand and answered, his voice instantly reverting to its cold, commanding tone. He listened for a moment, his jaw tight. "They know I have a woman here," he said, looking at her. "They don't know who you are. But they see you as leverage." The threat was no longer just about him. It was about her. The Falcons had made her a target. A strange, unwelcome sense of safety washed over her. Here, in this room with this dangerous man, she was protected. He finished the call, his expression grim. He walked over to the bar and poured himself another whiskey, his back to her. She thought he was considering his next move against his enemies. But then he spoke to his underboss, his voice low but carrying in the silent room. "The girl is a loose end," he said, his tone chillingly practical. "We find out what she knows, and then she disappears." Maya's blood ran cold. The fragile sense of connection, of safety, shattered into a million pieces. She was not under his protection. She was his prisoner, a problem to be managed, a loose end to be tied up permanently. She had mistaken his strategic interest for something personal. She had mistaken the predator's focus for care. And that was a mistake that could get her killed. Fear, cold and sharp, finally pierced through her composure. She had to get out. But running was impossible. The building was his, the men were his, the city was his. Running would only make her a target for him as well as his enemies. She had only one path forward. She couldn't be a loose end. She had to make herself essential. She stood up, her movements deliberate. She walked toward him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He turned, his eyes questioning her approach. "Your brother," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The photograph. My grandmother told me he loved the old church at the edge of the village. He said it was the only place he felt at peace." Dante's eyes narrowed. "What of it?" "She also told me about the Falcons, about how they operate. They don't strike at the head. They strike at the heart. They don't attack the man. They attack what the man loves. A feud isn't about business for them. It's about history. It's about memory." She took a breath, praying she was right. "They aren't just sending a message to you. They're sending a message to Marco. They're desecrating his memory. The sniper shot wasn't meant to kill you. It was meant to show you they could reach you anywhere. Their next move won't be here. It will be against something he cared about. Something that represents him. Dante stared at her, his expression a mask of stone. He was weighing her words, his tactical mind dissecting her theory. His men would be telling him to fortify his position, to hit the Falcons head-on. A direct, brutal counterattack. But she was offering him a different kind of intelligence, one born from whispers and memory, from the very history that connected them. There's an old social club downtown, he said slowly, thinking aloud. In Little Italy. Marco founded it. It was his legacy. That's where they'll go, she said with a certainty that surprised even herself. Not with guns. With fire. They'll try to burn it down. Erase him. The silence in the room was absolute. Dante's gaze was fixed on her, searching, dissecting. He was a man who trusted no one, who had learned through loss that betrayal was the only currency with any real value. But she was not one of his men. She was an echo of his past, a ghost from his brother's life. And she was telling him something his own instincts recognized as truth. He turned and picked up his phone. He barked a series of orders in crisp, lethal English. The plan had changed. His men were no longer defending the fortress. They were going to the club. They were setting a trap. He hung up and looked at her, a new light in his eyes. It was not warmth, not yet. It was respect. A grudging acknowledgement that she was not a liability, but an asset. A weapon he did not know he had. The hours that followed were the longest of her life. They waited in the silent penthouse as the storm broke over the city, rain lashing against the broken window. Neither of them spoke. The battle was being fought miles away, in the narrow streets of a neighborhood that clung to the old ways. Maya's life depended on the outcome. If she was wrong, Dante would have no more use for her. She would be a loose end once again. Finally, his phone rang. He answered. He listened, his face giving nothing away. Then he said 2 words. It is done. He hung up and turned to her. You were right. They walked right into it. The Falcone leadership is dismantled. Relief washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. She had survived. She had made herself necessary. Dante walked to the bar and poured 2 glasses this time. He crossed the room and handed one to her. His fingers brushed against hers, a deliberate touch that sent a current through her. My brother's name was Marco, he said, finally giving her the piece of himself he had guarded so closely. He trusted the wrong people. I do not make that mistake, he held her gaze, his eyes dark and serious. The Falcons who are left believe you are my woman. They will not touch you again, because they know to touch you is to start a war they cannot win. It was not a question. It was a declaration. A claim. He was not asking her to stay. He was telling her the price of her own survival. He was binding her to him with a chain of protection that was also a cage. Her old life was gone. The waitress, the quiet apartment, the illusion of normalcy, all of it had been shattered along with the window. She could not go back. She had stitched his wound. She had helped him win a war. There was blood on her hands now, figuratively, but irrevocably. She looked from his face to the sprawling, glittering city beyond the window. A kingdom of light and shadow. A kingdom he ruled. She had come to this city to build a new life, to escape the ghosts of a past she never understood. And now she was standing beside the most powerful ghost of them all. She lifted the glass to her lips, the amber liquid burning a slow, steady path down her throat. She met his gaze in the dark reflection of the glass. She did not look away. In the ruins of her old life, she made a choice. It was not a choice for love, or for safety. It was a choice for power. A choice to stop being a pawn, and to become something else entirely. Something new. Something earned. And as Dante watched her, he saw not the frightened waitress from the restaurant, but the reflection of his own ruthless will to survive. He saw an equal.